The tears were supposed to end the conversation. That cracking voice, those red-rimmed eyes, that trembling pause in a London courtroom where silence suddenly felt sacred. Because when Prince Harry tells the world the press destroyed his life, the instinct is to believe him. Instantly. No questions, no doubt, just sympathy. But here's the problem nobody wants to say out loud. Emotion is not evidence. And sometimes, emotion is the perfect distraction. Because while the cameras locked onto Harry's tears, something else was quietly circling beneath the surface of this trial. Something far more dangerous than any headline. A contradiction? A timeline crack? A truth that doesn't scream? It waits. And the person holding that truth is not a journalist, not a tabloid editor, not a faceless media machine. It's Chelsy Davy. Yes, that Chelsy. The one history politely shoved to the sidelines. The ex. The woman who couldn't handle royal life. The one written off as a footnote while the world moved on. Except footnotes don't usually come with receipts. This week, Harry walked back into court to continue his war against associated newspapers, accusing them, yet again, of illegal tactics, privacy invasion, and turning his wife's life into what he called an absolute misery. And when he said, "my wife," the courtroom froze. Because the wife was Meghan Markle and invoking her pain is like dropping a verbal nuclear button. The narrative was clean, painful, heroic, man versus machine, victim versus vultures. But clean narratives are rarely honest ones, because behind the testimony, behind the moral crusade, behind the righteous anger, there's another version of events. One Harry didn't read aloud, one that never made it into the witness box, one that lives in private messages, call logs, timestamps, and quiet acknowledgments that were never meant to see daylight. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because according to material now being whispered about in legal and media circles, Harry didn't always believe the press was the source of those leaks. In fact, at the time some of the most sensitive details appeared in print, he allegedly believed something very different. That the information came from inside, not reporters, not photographers, not hackers, a palace aide, someone with access, someone close, someone who didn't need to intrude because they were already there. If that's true, and we're being careful here, this isn't a minor inconsistency, this isn't semantics, this goes straight to the heart of the lawsuit, because accusing journalists of illegal intrusion while privately acknowledging an internal leak is not just awkward, it's explosive. And that's where Chelsy Davy comes back into the story like a ghost everyone hoped would stay buried. For years, she stayed silent. No interviews, no clapbacks, no memoir teasers. While everyone else monetized trauma, Chelsy disappeared, built a life, avoided the spotlight, and refused to play the game. Which is exactly why her role now is so destabilizing. She isn't media hungry, she isn't fame driven, she isn't sloppy, she's legally trained, methodical, precise, and crucially, she was in direct communication with Harry during the exact period now under legal scrutiny. So ask yourself this: why would someone like that risk stepping anywhere near this fire now? According to people familiar with the situation, it isn't revenge, it isn't bitterness, and it definitely isn't nostalgia. It's discomfort. Deep, gnawing discomfort at watching a public narrative solidify that doesn't align with what she remembers or what she can document. Because silence is easy, until someone raises their right hand in court and turns a selective story into an official record. That's when silence becomes complicity. Harry's lawsuit hinges on one core idea, that private information about his life could only have come from illegal press activity. He rejected the idea that insiders were responsible. He dismissed it as a defense distraction. But behind closed doors, the tone was different. The private conversations weren't about hacking, they were about access. Who knew this? Who was present? Who could have spoken? Those aren't questions you ask when you believe journalists broke in. Those are questions you ask when you suspect betrayal. And betrayal hits differently, because suing a newspaper is easy compared to confronting someone inside your own circle. One is external, the other detonates trust, institutions, and accountability chains nobody wants to pull. That's the part the courtroom didn't hear. What makes this even more unsettling is the nature of the evidence. It isn't flashy. It isn't a dramatic screenshot dump. It's quiet, boring even. Messages sent before articles dropped, calls clustered around publication windows, conversations that don't scream certainty but reveal awareness, and awareness matters. Because if Harry knew or even suspected that an internal source was responsible at the time, then continuing to frame the harm exclusively as illegal press intrusion becomes selective, not necessarily malicious, human, strategic, convenient. Courts don't punish feelings, they punish omissions. The defense has already leaned hard on the argument that journalists relied on legitimate sources. At first, that sounded like industry boilerplate. Now it sounds surgical. Because if Harry privately acknowledged an internal leak, the defense isn't speculating. They're pointing to an alternative explanation that existed before this lawsuit was ever filed. And that raises questions nobody wants to ask out loud. Why wasn't that possibility explored publicly? Why wasn't internal betrayal addressed head-on? Why did the narrative narrow instead of widen? Because narrowing makes a better villain, and villains are easier to fight when they're abstract. The press doesn't have a face, a palace aide does. Naming them would open a door Harry may never have wanted opened. Internal investigations, institutional failures, and questions about oversight that don't stop with one leak. So instead, blame moved outward. The tabloids absorbed the outrage, the story stayed clean. Until it didn't. Because Chelsy Davy exists in the part of the timeline before the story hardened. Before lawyers, before strategy, before certainty replaced confusion, she remembers the messy version. The one where answers weren't clear and suspicion pointed inward, and courts trust early truths more than polished ones. Right now, none of this has been argued openly before the judge. Harry hasn't been directly confronted with these communications, but their existence changes everything. It introduces doubt, not about pain, but about storytelling. Because there is a difference between emotional truth and factual completeness. And once that gap appears, it doesn't close quietly. The most dangerous evidence in this case may not come from newspapers at all. It may come from someone who stayed silent long enough to watch a narrative drift and finally decided she couldn't watch it drift any further. Because if the story told under oath doesn't fully match the story acknowledged in private, what happens next won't just affect this lawsuit, it will rewrite how everything that came before is understood. And that reckoning hasn't even started yet, because once the court starts asking why something wasn't said, the story stops being about tabloids and starts being about choice, and choice is where this whole case becomes radioactive. The moment you strip away the emotion, strip away the familiar villain of the British press, strip away the inherited trauma narrative, what you're left with is something far more dangerous than harassment. You're left with structure, with sequencing, with intent. And courts don't argue with feelings, but they interrogate structure. Here's the quiet shift that almost no one noticed. In the courtroom, the story ran in a straight line. Private details appeared. The press must have intruded. The harm followed. But in real time, that wasn't how it unfolded. In real time, the story looped. Recognition came before publication. Suspicion ran alongside it. Discussion happened during it. That alone should make anyone uncomfortable. Because when someone reacts after an article drops, that's pain. When they react before or during, that's awareness. And awareness changes everything. The private messages don't read like shock. They read like realization, like someone connecting dots they didn't want to connect. Who knew this? Who was there? Who had access? Those aren't the words of a man convinced he's been hacked. Those are the words of a man realizing something slipped from the inside. And once that realization exists, even briefly, it never fully disappears. But here's the human part nobody wants to admit. Confronting the press is loud, public, righteous. Confronting betrayal is quiet, personal, devastating. If the leak came from a journalist, you sue. If it came from someone you trusted, you hesitate, because naming an internal source doesn't just expose them, it exposes the system that protected them. It raises questions about palace culture, information control, loyalty, and oversight. It drags an entire institution into the light, and institutions hate light. So the story simplified, not because it was false, because it was survivable. Blaming the press allowed Harry to channel anger outward instead of inward. It gave the pain a target that didn't require reopening relationships, questioning judgment, or detonating internal structures. And emotionally, that makes sense. Legally, it's a liability, because the law doesn't care why you chose one narrative over another. It only cares whether you knew another one existed. And that's where this case starts to wobble. The defense doesn't need to prove Harry lied. That bar is high. What they need to show is that he knew the story was more complicated than he presented and chose to present it anyway. That's enough to weaken credibility, enough to introduce doubt, enough to shift the burden. This is why the unnamed palace aide has become the ghost at the center of everything. Because once you accept that an internal source may have existed and may have been acknowledged at the time, the press stops being the origin of harm and becomes the amplifier. And amplification, while ethically messy, is legally different from illegal acquisition. That distinction isn't emotional, it's surgical, and it explains something else that's been quietly nagging at this case from the beginning. Why no internal investigation was ever front and center. Why no accountability within the palace was publicly pursued. Why the narrative never widened, it narrowed. Because widening would have fractured the case. This is where Chelsy Davy becomes impossible to dismiss. She isn't part of the legal strategy. She predates it. She exists in the messy middle where nothing was clear yet, where Harry hadn't decided what the story was, where confusion still outweighed certainty. She heard the doubts before they were smoothed away. She saw the suspicion before it became inconvenient. She witnessed the moment when the story could have gone another way, and she stayed silent. For years. That silence wasn't passive, it was intentional. People close to her describe it as disciplined, a refusal to be dragged into a narrative that was already moving faster than truth could keep up with. But silence has limits, and that limit is reached the moment a selective version of events becomes official record. Because once something is said under oath, it stops being a story. It becomes history. That's when memory turns into evidence. And that's when earlier truths, unpolished, unresolved, uncomfortable, become dangerous. This is why the material Chelsy reportedly holds doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse. It waits. Messages. Logs. Timing. The kind of evidence that doesn't care about tone or sympathy. The kind that doesn't argue back. Courts fear quiet evidence, because quiet evidence doesn't collapse under cross-examination. It just sits there asking the same question over and over again. What did you know, and when? And if the answer to that question doesn't line up with testimony, everything changes. This isn't about villainizing Harry. That's the lazy take. This is about recognizing how trauma, strategy, and storytelling can collide and what happens when the collision leaves fingerprints. Because it's entirely possible to be genuinely hurt and selectively incomplete. Entirely possible to believe your own narrative while forgetting the version that came before it. Entirely possible for emotional truth to overwrite factual complexity. But courts don't operate on belief, they operate on record, and records don't evolve, they don't forget, they don't soften, they just exist. That's why this case no longer feels like a referendum on tabloid ethics alone. It feels like a referendum on narrative responsibility, on whether a public moral crusade can survive the discovery that its foundation may have been simplified for survival. The danger here isn't a guilty verdict or a dismissed claim. The danger is credibility erosion, because once a judge starts to suspect that the full picture wasn't presented, not hidden, but curated, every emotional appeal loses weight. Every tear becomes heavier. Every certainty invites re-examination. And that's where the reckoning truly begins. Not with the press, not with headlines, but with the realization that the story everyone accepted might not be wrong, just incomplete. And incompleteness under oath is a crack you can't plaster over with emotion. So now the question hanging over this courtroom isn't whether the press crossed lines, it's whether the narrative crossed convenience, whether pain became strategy, whether clarity replaced complexity, whether a simpler enemy was chosen over a closer truth, and whether the person who once stayed silent can keep staying silent now that the record is set. Because if those early acknowledgments ever make it into open court, this case won't just change direction. It will collapse inward, and the most devastating moment won't be a headline or a verdict. It will be the realization that the truth didn't arrive late. It was there from the beginning, waiting.